The Plain Truth, a show where we explore various mysteries, anomalies, and a little bit of conspiratorial stuff. I'm your host, Plain, and along for the ride is my friend Oolong Rabbit and our special guest this week, Jan Irvin. Jan is becoming a little bit well known for his work with discussing the Archaic revival and some of the problems behind the people who were bringing us this concept. And then also his work on the trivium and quadrivium, a return to classical education, which is really long overdue in this age of being dumbed down. So, Jan, are you there?
I am here.
Well, thanks for coming this
me.
week. Appreciate it. Why don't we get just jumping into the heart of the matter? Your website, the most famous one, I guess, is gnosticmedia.com, right?
Correct.
And on there, I've been there many, many times, and you have a lot of very interesting articles and then some of your interviews and so on. And I think one of the ones that really kind of grabbed me, so to speak, is when you were talking about the manufacturing of the deadhead. Could you give us a little bit of info on that?
Sure. Well, that's an article that I wrote and published recently with Joe Atwill. Joe Atwill's the author of Caesar's Messiah, the Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus. And I had interviewed him a couple of years ago for my show, and we had gotten together to do the interview, and it was an on-camera interview, and I took all of my documents and things that I collected over the years out of various university archives and showed him all of this stuff and, laid it all out, and he was pretty blown away, and he had already read my article at that point. So during that interview, he and I sort of started putting some of the pieces together and just sort of started clicking, and we started writing articles together. And this last one was called Manufacturing the Deadhead, a Product of Social Engineering.
Well, I guess this would raise all kinds of questions, like who might want to manufacture a deadhead?
Well, that is a very good question. And the question comes down to essentially getting people to think that they're free while they're actually in servitude. Now, in light of this statement, there was a very good quote that Aldous Huxley made, and I'll just read part of it here. It says, "Within the next generation, I believe that the world's rulers will discover that infant conditioning and narco-hypnosis are more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, and that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging and kicking them into obedience." And then a couple of years later, Louis Jolyon West, who is a known MK Ultra researcher who was friends of Aldous Huxley's, cites Aldous Huxley in the very application of this in society. Now, we have a lot more research that's, we're writing another article right now that has some new goodies that we've found since then. But we also came across this Italian professor, Piero Comparesi, who in his book, Bread of Dreams, he talks about these exact sort of things going on. And he says adulterated breads had been put into circulation by the Unitary of Public Health, criminal attacks orchestrated by the provisionary judges who were supposed to oversee the well-balanced provisioning of the public square. On the 21st, a Sunday, with Monday approaching, and then there's, it says master, and then there's a blank in the manuscript, Forney, judge of provisions in the square of Modena, was arrested along with bakers for having 40 sacks of bay leaves ground and put into the wheat flour to be made for the square, where it caused the poverty of those who bought it to worsen, so that for 2 days there were many people sick enough to go crazy, and during this time they could not work or help their families. And then he continues, it would be wrong to suppose that one must wait for the arrival of the 18th century capitalism or even of imperialism in order to see the birth of the problem of the masses spreading of the mass spreading of opium derivatives, first of morphine and then today of heroin, used to dampen the frenzy of the masses and lead them back by means of dreams, and this is key here, to the reason desired by the groups in power. The opium war against China, the Black Panthers, broken by drugs, and the ebbing of the American and European student movements, supposing that hallucinogenic drugs were involved in the latter, as some believe, are the most commonly used examples. We don't know what the relevance to demonstrate how advanced capitalism and imperialism have utilized mechanisms which induced collective dreaming and weakened the desire for renewal by means of visionary trips in order to impose their will. And he goes on from there, but that should give you the idea of it.
Well, that raises a lot of questions. I mean, for most of us, I think it's easy to see why the British wanted to spread opium throughout China, right? I mean, it was a profit center.
And then they usually stop right there, right? And it's like, well, they can't consider their own favorite drugs and, how these things were promoted or, or whatever. But, yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny. At the moment, I'm in a skyscraper in Hong Kong looking out over the water. And Hong Kong has something like a third of the world's skyscrapers, something ridiculous. And you have to say, how did that happen? Well, it happened because the British created this place for their opium profit center. So it's quite appropriate in the modern world to think that I guess that quote is the past isn't even over, right? It's not even the past, as Faulkner was saying. So it's clearly important in our time too, and then the whole drug culture that was created in the U.S. But I guess I still think though it's easy for everybody to say, okay, they like money, they like control, fine, I can see that. But it's a little harder to see beyond that in terms of controlling people's dreams or, enjoying their servitude. In other words, you look at the Opium War and you see that people are drugged out, essentially. They're just not moving. And so
well,
they're easy.
There was a couple of stages, and let me just interrupt you there. Sorry about that. But there were a couple of stages that things went through to get people to sort of, where they're at right now. And, there was, have you, any of you heard of Edward Bernays?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, Edward Bernays, and let me just pull that up in my article here. He actually was one of the, he wasn't really the founder, so to speak, in anything that we found directly with the psychedelic movement. But he was, we do know for a fact, a close friend of Gordon Wasson, who was the discoverer of magic mushrooms. And so, it's Edward Bernays' work. And he says in the first paragraph of his book, Propaganda, quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society." And of course, he's using sophism to sell all of this, which is tricks, essentially, to justify this whole thing. But then he continues, "Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our society. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. This is the logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society." Of course, the type of society that they want under their control, etc. "In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes of social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. And again, the reason why he is important is because he and Gordon Wasson, the discoverer of magic mushrooms, were close friends. Edward Bernays is the father of propaganda or public relations spin. Of course, we know now that Gordon Wasson was the vice president of propaganda for J.P. Morgan Bank. And then when we go further down the line, now we know guys like Terence McKenna were propaganda for either the FBI or the CIA, as he admits he was working in the propaganda or PR department for 15 years. And we also see this exact type of stuff with Timothy Leary. But, so we have these themes here that are going on. And interestingly, another thing that they created was the idea of the music idol. And when you look at how Terence McKenna and Wasson and Leary and Hoffman and these guys have all been sold as these idols, it all makes sense. And Edward Bernays, he brags about this. He says, human beings need to have Godhead symbols. The public relations councils must help to create them. Bernays saw this idol making as vital to the salvation of society. Quote, we have no being in the air to watch over us. We must watch over ourselves, and that is where public relations counselors can prove their effectiveness, by making the public believe that human gods are watching over us for our own benefit. And, so this is the type of thing that he's saying here. But, he was the one who created the entire notion of the rock idol, ironically, quote unquote, rock idols, like going back to pagan myths. But he's the one who created the idea of the rock idol or the rock star. And the first star that they created was this guy, Enrico Caruso. And, he says the overwhelming majority of the people who reacted so spontaneously to Caruso had never heard of him before. The public's ability to create its own heroes from wisps of impressions and its own imagination, and to build them into almost into flesh and blood gods, fascinated me. Of course, I knew that the ancient Greeks and other civilized peoples had done this, but now it was happening before my eyes in contemporary America. And that was Edward Bernays. And this is the kind of stuff that they were and are doing, creating these idols. And it's no surprise that, it was these propaganda guys that created this idea. And then we have Gordon Wasson and Terence McKenna and all of these guys that are suddenly idols. You guys get the joke here,
Yes. I mean, there's no question that this is what they've done. I mean, they've created stars in sports and Hollywood and just about everything, certainly music. Again, I am a little curious, though, for the sake of people who aren't familiar with the topic, where they see a lot of this as being money making, right? There's a lot of money to be made in the Beatles or Elvis Presley. But I'd say there's the superficial level of the money, but then there's also the fact that they created a drug culture which was worth far more money.
Well,
and
sure,
then,
not only...
At an even higher level is that it controls the context of where the society is going. And I think now we're getting to more of the Greek philosophers like Plato or something, discussing how basically if you control music, you control a society.
Sure, and didn't Plato want to ban the musicians and poets, ironically, right? But guys like Terence McKenna always bragged, he always talked about being a bard. And if you look up a bard, and let me just type it in here real quick, but I'll just pull up the Wikipedia entry here. It says bard, and it's just finishing coming up here, and it says, hold on to see. Anyway, I'm just failing to see it right now. But anyway, it's somebody who is hired to sing the praises of the king, right? And so it's here it is. It's bard was a professional poet employed by a patron, such as a monarch or nobleman, to commemorate the patron's ancestors and to praise the patron's own activities.
Sounds perfect.
Yeah, some of this even goes back. I'm thinking of Friedrich Nietzsche. I think his ideal man or his Superman was essentially a balance of the Dionysian and the Apolloan forces. Do you think that that sort of ties in with what they're doing with the drug and music culture?
Well, I definitely think there is a lot to do with that. I just mentioned the word rock idol, and then they sort of use these pagan themes. And there's a couple of authors out there who have sort of brought this stuff out to the forefront, but they don't really get into the real depth of what I've found it more likely to be about now. In my article, Manufacturing the Deadhead, towards the end, we talk about the secrets of Ulysses, the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, which were religious rituals that went on there for about 2,000 years. And, so anyway, in the beginning of The Road to Ulysses, written by Gordon Wasson and Carl Ruck, who argue this whole thing, they argue that the Eleusinian mysteries were based off of a derivative of ergot, or essentially early LSD. And there was all this secrecy surrounding the whole thing. But Wasson says in the introduction, quote, "The initiates lived through the night in the telesterion of Ulysses under the leadership of the two hierophanic families, the Eumolpids and the Kirkes, and they would come away all wonderstruck by what they had lived through. According to some, they were never the same as before." And then in the first chapter of the book, Wasson continues, "Early man in Greece in the second millennium before Christ founded the mysteries of Ulysses, and they held spellbound the initiates who each year attended the rite. Silence was to what took place there was obligatory. The laws of Athens were extreme in the penalties that were imposed on any who infringed on the secret." So right here we see this is a state-sanctioned religion, okay? But throughout the Greek world, far beyond the reach of Athens, the secret was kept spontaneously throughout antiquity. See, right here we see Wasson's PR tricks coming in, and he's like, okay, there were strict and extreme laws in Athens, but it was kept simultaneously, it was kept a secret throughout the ancient world. He doesn't supply any evidence for that claim or anything, but it was under penalty of death, like Socrates. And so he continues, "And since the suspension of the mysteries in the 4th century AD, the secret has become a built-in element in the lore of ancient Greece. I would not be surprised if some classical scholars would even feel that we are guilty of sacrilegious outrage at now prying open the secret." On 15 of November 1956, I read a paper, anyway, going on from there, but he's admitting that the people come across, or it's being controlled by two families, that they're coming away wonderstruck and they're held spellbound. He admits that everything regarding the mysteries is under secret or penalty of death. And, and then he claims that the whole thing was kept spontaneously. And so we see that it's a government-sanctioned religion. Now, every single member of society was allowed to do this ritual once in their lives, and including the slaves. So, and they prepared for a year before they did this. So they have this whole ritual preparation, and then you have this big climactic experience. You're only allowed to have it once. It's all secret under penalty of death. Anybody who does this, like Socrates, gets killed for revealing the secrets of the Kykeon. And so we can see this going on throughout this whole period for 2,000 years, and then it becomes crushed. And so, this whole thing has been sold to us as well. All of these people, it was this great religious, experience, and that's why. But interestingly, and I have the quote here someplace, but Oscar Yoniger in like 1978 or 79, he says that the only time that the religious psychedelic experience happened was when you crossed the Colorado River.
Could you repeat that or restate that last bit?
I thought you would. So Oscar Yoniger, who is one of the key people behind MKUltra, he was at the Macy Foundation conferences, etc. He says, and this is from a conversation on LSD, and it's a really good stuff. But he says, and then Zenberg says that the revolutionary experience and all of the things that he was doing at Harvard and all the others, his residents, and the rest he was doing, he was giving LSD to. They never had a visionary or ecstatic experience. Or ecstatic or mystic experience. The whole thing was a California invention, he said. And then, excuse me, hold on a second. And then he goes, and then Larry says, that's right. And then Yoniger continues, or Janiger, he continues, the only time it happened was when you cross the Colorado River. And so, you know, what they're doing is essentially, it's all tongue-in-cheek here. They PR'd all of this. You guys have to realize these guys are all PR guys. Now, when you get into the origins, and let me just explain this, because this is actually pretty important to understand here. Originally, you know, and I've done for all of the people out there, you know, that are jumping up and down in their chairs or whatnot and screaming and everything, he's never tried psychedelics, he doesn't get it. I've actually experienced them many hundreds of times. I went through the whole psychedelic field. I was, you know, I'm a researcher and writer in this field, and it was through my research and experience and such passion in it for so many years that I sort of discovered all of this stuff about Wasson and everything else, you know. And it's like when you see contradictions and things, that's a lie. And so, you know, in like 2006 or so, 2005, I started spotting all of these contradictions and just started writing them down. But, you know, so what we see happening here, though, is that they actually remarketed these things. So in the early 1950s, the military called entheogens or psychedelics, they called them psychotomimetics, which means psychosis mimicking. Now, of course, I'm not trying to attack any native religions or anything like that. And through the quadrivium, there probably is something possible there. I'm not trying to discount the possibility, but what we see is these substances being used for control, and without people understanding how they're used for control, they can be fooled. So anyway, the first word they used was psychotomimetic, which means psychosis mimicking. And then later on, Aldous Huxley, who was one of the head guys in charge of MKUltra. Aldous Huxley wasn't, you know, just this beatnik author, this innocent guy who was trying to warn us. He was actually one of the key engineers behind the entire operation. And I just had a general on my show last week, General Stubblebine, who was the former head of Army intelligence, who confirmed that, yes, he did believe that Aldous Huxley was the head guy regarding MKUltra. Now, so Aldous Huxley creates this word phanerothym, and it's not marketable. It doesn't go anywhere. So his good pal and another top guy involved in MKUltra that we've since figured out, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, he creates the word psychedelic or psychodelic properly. Now, later on, they, and this is actually revealed in this video, a conversation on LSD, and they talk about it in Huxley's book Moksha. But when you piece all of this stuff together, they go out and they hire Leary to promote LSD everywhere. Now, what happened was essentially what you had was in the 1950s, they did this, 1951, they dosed the entire village of Pont Saint-Esprit in France. And 5 people, I think, die in that. 300 or 400 people were dosed. A lot of people had continuing health problems. They held the whole community up in court for a decade, screwing over the public. You know, it was all just to study the effects of LSD, and Sandoz just happened to be not far away, and you know, Albert Hoffman happened to be there when all of this stuff was going on as well. But when we look at this situation, what we see is that they had an issue with how they could get how they could apply these substances as weapons. So rather than trying to get it into the water or the air or something like this, they decided that they would do another thing, and they would remarket it and see if they could get people to self-administer the drug. And so then, and it was about in 1965 that they launched this idea in San Francisco with Leary and with all of these guys marketing this idea. Now, Leary pushes it up, and then he, quote unquote, ruins the word psychedelic. And so then in the late 1970s, Wasson, along with Carl Ruck and Jonathan Ott and Jeremy Bigwood, they create the word entheogen, which is then promoted from there.
Does Andrea Purich factor this as far as you found out?
Is he a part of this as far as I've found out?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wrote about him in my book, The Holy Mushroom, that I published in 2008. But Andrea Puharich, he was, what was he? He was at Edgewood, Maryland's, Edgewood Arsenal Center there, and he was one of the chief guys in charge of Army chemicals and things like that, the Army Chemical Division. And he worked directly with Wasson, and I've exposed that since then. He and Wasson talked about doing these studies on mushrooms, and he and Wasson talk about going on trips together regarding the mushrooms and stuff like this. But interestingly, Andrea Puharich goes on later to, he is in charge of the quote-unquote nine over at the Esalen Institute that's caught up in all sorts of nefarious things after that. And, they've been connected to the Kennedy assassination and many other things, outside of that. So, yeah, Puharich is definitely a large player in all of this.
And one more question, Jan. You mentioned that Wasson wrote the rights Ulysses were based on ergotamine, I guess you would call it, or what LSD is manufactured from.
Well, they were basically saying that they had figured out how to make LSD then.
In your opinion, would it have been ergotamine, or would it have been, say, the flageric mushrooms, or I guess really just speculation?
It's just speculation. But the whole point is that some form of psychedelic drug was used to give people an experience that empowered the elite to keep them under total control from there on throughout their lives, essentially.
And you also mentioned in your article there's an author called Leo Puritz, I believe, who wrote
Leo Puritz, right?
Yeah, wrote a novel called St. Peter's Snow.
Right, and I should give credit to Alan Piper for that, because Alan Piper is the one who discovered that book and pointed it out to me, and he published an article. When was it? It was a few months back, but I'm just trying to find where it is here. Let's see. And it was published in Time and Mind in July. And so anyway, yeah, essentially what we find out in St. Peter's Snow by Leo Puritz is that they were talking about an ergot derivative in 1933, 5 years before Hoffman supposedly discovered the drug, and 10 years before he supposedly had his first experience with it in 1943, which is the so-called Bicycle Day. But in 1933, this guy, Leo Puritz, publishes this book where they're talking about an ergot from wheat. It's in the Alps, which of course are in Switzerland, and they call it St. Peter's Snow. And, so the whole thing, it happens where Hoffman supposedly invents the drug, right? But it's 5 years before any of it takes place. So and the irony here is that they use it to start a communist revolution, and so when you sit here and you look at this whole thing, it's like, wait, communist revolution, they're talking about communist revolution here. And how they promoted communism through the psychedelic 60s and all of this and all of the, feminism, and anybody who wants to study Karen of Girl Writes What, Karen Strauern of Girl Writes What, she's spent many years exposing feminism and that whole thing as well. But so they're promoting the feminism and the transhumanism and the humanism and these key elements. But you see this, you see sort of these same ideas showing up in 1933 in Prutz's book. So if you guys want, I'll read a little bit of it here. But he says, a few months later, I came across the incomparably and more important testimony of Dionysius the Areopagite, sorry, I can't pronounce that, a 4th century Christian Neoplatonist who states in one of his works that he imposed a 2-day fast on the members of his community who longed for the real presence of God, and then he regaled them with the bread made of holy flour, quote unquote. I came across an ancient Roman rural priest's song, a solemn invocation of Marmar or Mavor, who at the time was not yet the bloodthirsty god of war, but the peaceful protector of the fields. Let your white frost invade the crops so that they acknowledge thy power, it said. Like all priests, Roman rural priests knew the secret of the hallucinogenic drug that produces states of ecstasy in which the people become, quote unquote, seen and, quote, acknowledge the power of the god, end quote. The white frost was not a kind of wheat, but a wheat disease, a parasite, a fungus that invaded the wheat and fed on its substance. There are many kinds of this parasitic fungi. The Baron went on, and remember, this is a novel that this is all from. The Acidomites, the Physomites, the Bacillomites, and in his synopsis, Fungorum, Bargan describes more than 100 varieties, and nowadays his work is regarded as out of date. But among that 100, I had identified the only one that produces ecstatic effects when it is introduced into human food and thus finds its way into the human organism. There is or was a wheat disease that was often described in earlier centuries and was known by a different name wherever it appeared. In Spain, it was called Mary Magdalene's Plate. In Alsace, it was known as Poor Souls Do. In Adam of Cremona's physician's book, it was called Mesericord seed, excuse me again. And in the Alps, it was called St. Peter's Snow. And then they go on and they, I have the next quote here about them talking about it starting a communist revolution, but they're sitting there and they're having an argument over if they should try the drug. And then he says, he maintained that he and I should not take it, but I disagreed. We were the leaders, he said. We must remain clear-headed. So it's like he's the Al Hubbard or Johnny Appleseed of LSD back in the 1933s in this novel. And dispassionate above all things, our task was to lead and not to be carried away. That's what the quarrel was about. I said that being above it meant being out of it. And just because he was the leader, he must feel and think that the crowd, what the crowd thought and felt. And then later in the story, we find that this character is actually the one leading the communist rebellion. So anyway, that's
hey,
how. Yeah.
Jan, can I ask a question here? Not exactly playing devil's advocate, but I am curious. Do we have an idea how drug use today compares with 100, 200, 300 years ago? Because, for example, I was under the impression that hardcore alcoholism was a lot more common 100 years ago than it is today in, the West. And that might be a mistake. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is, some are likely to argue that the rise of some of these other drugs is just a replacement for what people used in the past. Right? I mean, we know before the drug laws came around that people were taking laudanum and other things, right? And just hardcore booze.
Well, but I mean, if you go back and you look at I forget the name of it and properly, but the German Beer Purity Act of, the 1600s, late 1500s, whenever it was, the entire purpose of that was to ban all of the psychedelic drugs that were being put into the beer. They were using henbane and belladonna and mandrake and all of these very strong drugs. And again, you have these, different groups that, that I read earlier, like from Piero Comparesi's book, Bread of Dreams, that, where they intentionally put these drugs in things to, get the people delirious. And not only that, but it was something that the church probably favored at times as well, because, obviously people would then have visions in their fancy stained glass cathedrals, right? I hope that answered your
sure.
question.
I'm with you. In spirit, but I just do think we always have to look at kind of the other side of arguments, and so
such as in which way?
Well, we're mostly talking about psychedelics here. But
Right.
For example, in the last 20, 30 years, hasn't it been a decline in psychedelics and a rise in, I guess you would call fluoride compounds, Prozac and, SSRIs and things like that? Hasn't
Well,
that
there
been the
was,
agenda?
I think there was a decline, and then you have definitely an increase again in the 80s with the ecstasy dance clubs into the 90s and early 2000s. And, right now you have MAPS and Rick Doblin, who, interestingly, he's the one who, through Mothers Against Drunk Driving, et cetera, he's the one who had MDMA or ecstasy outlawed. And then he founded MAPS to then have it legalized for medical use, which is pretty odd because it was already legal for medical use before he did that. But so you get this sort of dip in things, but it's like we were talking about earlier, them promoting heroin or psychedelics or whether it's alcohol. It's not just this or just that one or just the other one. They really like to use all of them. The alcohol people who can't control the alcohol, you keep them in control and watching the football games and hoorah. And you get the psychedelic people, to positive think and pillow sit and stay in the communes and, not organize effective dissent. And you get, the opium people addicted and wasting away, and the meth heads and everything else. It's like,
right. So it sounds like Brave New World.
Well,
You've got
that's
groups that are happy to be gammas, happy to be betas or whatever,
well,
and
that's
they take the
exactly the
drugs that
point,
all
isn't it?
gammas take.
Isn't that the entire point? That is the point, is that this is the creation of the Brave New World. Aldous Huxley was a Fabian socialist. He was an agent. We do know that. We've got confirmation from a top military official that he was an agent. We don't know what position he was in exactly. General wouldn't say, but we do know that he was an agent. We do know that he was very, very likely in charge of all of this stuff. So, they've been selling these things. And when you look at all of the drugs now in the water and all of the birth control, and, that was Huxley's dream, really. In fact, let me just read you guys a quote from Aldous Huxley that I found recently that's just one of my favorites on him, if I can find it here. It's from his book Moksha, and he's writing it, I think, to his sister or somebody like that, and he's like bragging about the tricks that he's doing in this, helping promote this final revolution that they're doing. But he says, and this is singing, the Epsilons are singing, and he says, "No more mammy, no more pappy. Ain't we lucky? Ain't we happy? Everyone's oh so happy. Everybody's happy now. Sex galore, but no more marriages. No more pushing baby carriages. No one has to change a nappy. Ain't we lucky? Ain't we happy? Everybody's happy now. Dope for tea and dope for dinner. Fun all night and love and laughter. No remorse, no morning after. Where's the sin and who's the sinner? Everybody's happy now. Girls pneumatic, girls exotic, girls ecstatic, girls erotic. Hug me, baby. Make it snappy. Everybody's oh so happy. Everybody's happy now. Lots to eat and hours for drinking. Soma cocktails. No more thinking. No more thinking. No more thinking." And so when we realize that Aldous Huxley, this is his agenda, and he's working with Gordon Wasson and Alan Dulles and these guys at the Century Club that was basically a CIA front. we see all of them hanging out there at this club. And then we see Gordon Wasson go out and start arguing that the Amanita was the ancient Rigvedic Soma. Now, Wasson got that idea originally from John G. Bork's 1891 book, The Scatologic Rights of All Nations. That wasn't even originally, Wasson's idea. He saw another author write about it 50 years earlier. Then he steals that idea and creates the field of ethnomycology out of it.
Now, okay, so if Huxley is a Tavistock agent, I mean, from my reading of Brave New World, I don't think it's pushing it as a positive thing.
I can barely hear you. You're cutting in and out really bad. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, sorry. I just said, as far as Huxley being a Tavistock agent, if you were to read Brave New World, like, it doesn't look like he paints it in a favorable light.
It does not put him in a favorable light?
I would say it does not put the Brave New World type plan in a favorable light.
Yeah, it's really hard for me to understand you, but yeah,
Jan, let me say what I think he's trying to say, which is he's saying if one reads the book Brave New World, it looks more like a warning than a goal, right?
Well, it's a plan book, but you can't take it just the one book, and this is the whole issue. Is Huxley, at his Berkeley talk, he's on TV and stuff like this, and he's warning people that this stuff is going on, but he never tells you that he's actually, if you read his book Moksha, he knows, for instance, October 26, 1956 or something like that, or 1954 in Moksha. It's probably page 52 or 56. In that book, he's talking about Army LSD experiments. Okay, in that book, and it's Andrea Puharich's LSD experiments from Edgewood, Maryland. Now, we're talking 1954. This is almost 20 years before the MK Ultra program was exposed. Now, how does Huxley have this information? Not only that, but we see Huxley actually suggesting different studies. And in one place in his book, Moksha, he's actually suggesting to them, we need these hypnosis studies. And then if you flip open to, I think, page 7 or so, or maybe it's in the introduction of Acid Dreams from Marty Lee, you see all of these doctors complaining about these ridiculous hypnosis studies that they're being required to do while the person is under the drugs, and all the doctors are complaining that it doesn't work. Then we also read further in Moksha, and you can compare it to David Black's book, Acid Dreams. We see Aldous Huxley at one of the Macy conferences. Now, mind you, Macy created MK Ultra. The whole Project MK Ultra came out of the Macy Foundation. So in 1961, we see Aldous Huxley in Moksha writing about how he's just gotten back from San Francisco from this mind control conference that's put on by the Macy conferences. You flip open David Black's book and you read in there and you have total confirmation. Yep, it's the same thing, same place, same date, everything. So again, Aldous Huxley was a Fabian socialist. Okay, and when we get into his history, his grandfather was Aldous Huxley's bulldog. He was his PR manager. And Aldous Huxley's brother, Julian Huxley, also headed the British Eugenics Society. Now, Aldous Huxley...
Well, he also was the head of UNESCO, wasn't he?
He was also the head of UNESCO, indeed, which heavily connects into eugenics, this new garbage Common Core education that's going around today and all of this stuff that we've been trying to expose. But this
and I think the issue with this is, from my point of view, some people can't detect vampires properly.
Okay.
And by that, what I mean is when you see somebody like Huxley talking on TV, I mean, he was on American TV a few times that I've seen anyway.
Sure.
To me, he just oozes evil. Right.
Sure.
I mean, you can just tell that this guy's bad news all around. I mean, when he talks, it's always from the perspective like we're a lab rat. You know what I mean? It's a guy who
Well,
likes
he's
watching
a
snakes
total
eat.
sociopath. He's a
Right.
sociopath. He assumes false authority. He lives on the ad verecundium fallacy that he is this high almighty intellectual. Meanwhile, he's just this fallacious thinking sociopath who goes around and decides for himself and his elite friends and family and oligarchs and whatnot, how the society should be run. And so he's laying all of this stuff out. But, he never, when he, in these warnings, quote unquote, that he puts out, he never warns you that it's him and his brother and his own family, and they're all married into the Darwin family and et cetera. And for more, for people that want more on that, go to my website, Gnostic Media, and listen to my recent interview with James Corbett on the Corbett report on MK Ultra, and we go into the whole history of the Huxley family and how they're into all of this eugenics and all of this stuff. But if people don't get that he is a Fabian socialist, then they don't realize, okay, well, he's never telling me, he's telling me somebody's doing it, but he's never telling me who is doing it. He never brings attention to himself or his brother or MK Ultra that he knows about 20 years before anybody else knows a thing about it. And how would he have this type of information? And in this book, you see him talking to many of the key players, seeing him admitting that he's at these mind control conferences and all of this good stuff. So, and then when we get he's a Fabian socialist, that is, their logo is a wolf in sheep's clothing. So, that is the whole point of what a Fabian socialist is.
I agree. Hey, Jan, I got a question for you. Some, like I think I've heard people like Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead say arguments along the lines of, the CIA or the government screwed up. In other words, they helped promote this psychedelic counterculture, but actually this was a mistake on their part.
How
would you respond to that?
Well, the CIA loves to play themselves up as these moronic dupes so that everybody just laughs at them. Meanwhile, they're doing all of this stuff. I mean, that's even written about in like the introduction of Acid Dreams, how the CIA and military love to make themselves look stupid so that people don't even look over there. They just think they're totally incompetent. But that is an intel smokescreen by itself. But that whole argument of, the CIA being willful idiots or dupes or whatever. I mean, that's just the oldest, most unfounded argument out there. I mean, people just regurgitate that argument. And I'm not saying anything against you, but, I hear that argument, probably 10 times a day. And, none of these people have ever gone into the background and looked at the foundations, gone through the archives, checked these people's backgrounds and affiliations, what they actually said and did and all of this stuff. And when you get in there and you actually look, the official storyline that was sold by Acid Dreams, in fact, and a lot of these other books, there's just no evidence for this thing being planned, they would say, and meanwhile they're citing the video, a conversation on LSD, but they only quote the first 20 seconds of the video. And then they omit like later on in the video when let me read you this. In fact, in the video, a conversation on LSD, Timothy Leary, he says, our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very cool about it, and yet they did more in a very laid-back way. And it's every bit as public as some of the other, the buses running around the country. In other words, Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, right? So he's identifying Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters as his undercover agents, and he's admitting right there that they're all agents, And so, I mean, people just they put this stuff out there, and everybody ignores it,
But Jan, I'm with you on this, but I think the argument these people would be making, for example, is that when you look back at the 1950s, at least in the U.S., you saw this bland corporate man kind of culture. right?
Right, sure.
And
Well, that's, I mean,
when you
everybody is, it's all PR though, but who created that marketing in the first place? You have to remember that the
I
guy who created that is Edward Bernays behind WASP.
yeah, and I'm with you. I'm with you 100%. But let me finish the argument. The
All right.
argument would be you had this kind of bland corporate white bread culture that was created, the corporate
Sure.
man and all that. And then the power elite could do what they wanted, which was start a war in Vietnam, even if they had to get rid of the president to do it. And that white bread culture was not going to stop the war in Vietnam, and that you had the counterculture types who were essentially, for lack of a better word, resisting some of the things that the power elite wanted, such as the Vietnam War.
Yeah,
Now,
see, that's just,
I'm
I
not
mean,
saying it's that simple, but I'm
it's
saying
not
they
even
make that
supported.
argument.
It's not even supported. I mean, anybody who wants to look at it, they'll see that there was a massive anti-war movement, and then basically they dropped LSD into it and Timothy Leary into it. It was already going. They dropped the drugs in there to break the anti-war movement up. As I believe I read from Piero Comparesi already earlier, that was what they did to break it up. So what you had was these very effective anti-war movements, and then what you do is you drop these drugs in there. You tell them that the experience is spiritual. Meanwhile, like mushrooms by the Mazatec Indians, they're used to find lost objects. They're used, for healing and things like that. They're not used in the spiritual way that we think of them. So they sell this whole idea of the drugs, like I was talking about earlier, from psychotomimetic to psychedelic to entheogen. So then they pitch that. But what happens is they actually break up the effectiveness of the anti-war movements that were already existing. Now, another problem is based on what authority do these sons of bitches have but their own false ad veracundium fallacy to and go impose their will on other people? I mean, Terence McKenna admits that they were intentionally trying to attack the middle class kids. So in Invisible Landscape, Jay Stevens, author of Storming Heaven, makes clear the true agenda of the McKenna brothers' work. And he says, our appetite for simplicity has caused us to compress the chaos of the 60s into one monolithic youth revolt. But there were two philosophies then among the revolutionaries on how the world might be remade. One path endorsed by political power and using the vantage to raise consciousness and save the world. The other path proposed an attack on the consciousness itself using a controversial and soon outlawed family of psychochemicals, the psychedelics. And that's from Jay Stevens. Now, in Archaic Revival, Terence McKenna admits, I'm very much at variance with the wisdom of hindsight and looking back at how Leary and Alpert and Ralph Metzner, and now mind you, they're all agents, and we know they're all agents and working together, handled it in the 60s, but try to launch a children's crusade, quote, try to co-opt the destiny of the children of the middle class using the media. And by the way, Henry Luce owned the media that they were talking about, and he's tied into all of this as well, as your advanced man. And it was very risky business, and it rebounded badly. And of course, this is what they wanted. The whole goal was just to promote the drugs into society, to co-opt society. They wanted essentially to recreate as McKenna called it, the Archaic Revival. When you get into these people's work, they're all talking about postmodernism or Neo-Feudalism or the Archaic Revival, bringing back a new dark age, this sort of thing. This is their theme, their goal that they're all pushing here. And this is, stuff that's found in their own words throughout. It's all primary.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think there's another argument, too, that we can see that's related, which was the creation of the hippie movement. Vito and his dancing crowd out of Sunset Boulevard and then spreading throughout California and the country, that's got the hands of these same people all over it. And it was designed to turn mainstream America against the anti-war movement. It's a perfect disruption.
What they do is they have a bunch of hippies that dress up and go out and do drugs, and then they basically have them go mingle with the war movement, or the anti-war movement, excuse me, and then it discredits them, you see. And so then
Yes,
rather than specific directed targets, then you have a bunch of people who are pillow sitting and saying, and Timothy Leary's whole thing was tune in, turn on, drop out. So I forget if it was 65, 66, 67, but every time there's a war protest, suddenly Leary would show up and he would say, ignore the war protest, ignore the soldiers, ignore all of them, leave them behind, forget them all, and tell everybody to just go off and just ignore the whole thing, turn it all off, leave all of those kids in Vietnam, etc. And, then in 69, after he's telling everybody to ignore politics and war and everything else, then in 69, he runs for the governor of California. You couldn't get any more tongue-in-cheek. So, the whole time they're showing up at these anti-war protests. They're telling people, oh, just ignore all of that. Don't do anything. You have the Student Democratic Society, the SDS, they get infiltrated and totally corrupted, and then they splinter off into the Weathermen and all of this stuff. And so then, and then you always have these, these agent provocateurs who go around in their boots with, stirring up violence during peaceful protests, always to allow the police to come in full force with guns, etc.
Right, and that's what we've got. We've got just constant infiltration and creation of strange groups to, lead society down a bad path, just about everywhere you can go. And I suppose that's a good segue into a more positive direction, which you've been focusing on, which is the trivium and quadrivium, which is really basically classical education. Perhaps we could switch into that a little bit and see, where do you think things are going? Do you think there's an increase in interest in this? Do you think we've got some hope on that front?
Well, the trivium over the last 4 years has definitely gotten some serious headway. I mean, I've seen, a couple of years ago, I saw a newspaper article out of Australia saying, wow, where did this sudden interest in the trivium come from? And I, couldn't help but chuckle about it. But, it's the thing is getting people, especially complacent adults, to get in and study something. And, most adults always approach new subjects as if they already know things about it before they've studied anything about it. You know what I mean?
Sure. I mean, I just think we're in 80 years or 100 years into this dumbing down process, at least in the States. So not too many people have had a classical education anymore.
Sure. And the real issue is that, it's getting people to approach things with questions rather than assuming that they know things first. And that is actually part of the trivium. One way that you control somebody is to get them to put their conclusions before they ask any questions. And the questions are always who, what, where, when, why, and how. I mean, we learn them in second grade, right? And so who, what, where, and when is actually known as grammar. We can call that part research, and then why is logic, and it removes the fallacies and the lies and the contradictions and errors. And then the output, the end part is the rhetoric, when we're explaining it to others and how it all works and how it all fits together. And so you have who, what, where, and when that gathers the information, why that processes it, and how that expresses it, and it always works in that order. So if somebody, say if they want to fool you, or if they want to get you to always appeal to somebody else's authority, like a policeman or, a doctor in a white coat or a politician in some Halloween costume, etc., all you would have to do is put logic before grammar. So then what happens is people who go through these compulsory education systems, and when this happens to them, they lose their self-confidence, their ability to find information. And in fact, they'll actually believe that there is no truth out there. And then, they'll actually, one further than that, they'll create entire systems of pseudoscientific studies, such as quantum physics, to sell that there is no truth out there. So when you look outside and you just look around you, there are no contradictions in nature. You don't see like bird alligator or plane tree or something, unless there is a crash or something like that, something that you can specifically understand. We don't see any contradictions out in nature when we look at these nouns and things out there. And of course, everything that you see out in the world is a noun. And then you apply adjectives and verbs and things to that. But if you don't know how to just look out in nature and realize, or gather those parts, and if you're always left to reach conclusions before you just look at the grammar or those nouns, then you're always going to come to false conclusions. So, if we just stop whenever we approach a new subject, we can say, hey, what do I know about this subject? Okay, I know this. XYZ. Well, where did I learn XYZ? Oh, well, I heard it from somebody else. Did I ever verify it myself? No. Okay, I don't know anything about this subject, so let me start over. I'm going to throw out everything I thought I knew, and I'm just going to start again. Who, what, where, and when. And then you gather that information, and then once you've gathered that information, then you can begin to understand why. But before you've gathered information, there is no why. You have to know who and what and where and when. You have to have these, subjects and predicates before you can have any why, before you can have an understanding of what happened there. So that's why always comes after who, what, where, and when. And then you can never express how something happens to somebody else before you know why or who, what, where, when. So, the last part, how, is based off of the first two, grammar and logic. So essentially, grammar is knowledge. Logic, the second part, is understanding. And then the last part, rhetoric, is wisdom. And so it's just a simple method that we can always go through to verify information. A lot of people will think, first off, well, I don't have time to do that. That would take up too much time. But, often it only takes, especially in the internet age, and when we learn logical fallacies, we can research things in a few minutes that we couldn't have researched in a couple of hours before. But, when you think of it in terms of, if you go out and you spend a few hours or a few days or a few weeks to verify something, consider that in comparison to spending a whole lifetime believing a lie. And by having gone out and spent the time doing that research, then you're competent to talk about it. You've looked at all of the nouns that are involved in that research and you know about it. You've removed all of the fallacies and contradictions and you understand it and you can explain it to others. So this is really what the Trivium is about, and it's just getting people to see actually the natural way that the mind works. It's not natural to put why before who, what, where, and when. Somebody has to trick us to do that. And, so then when we, essentially, if we just laugh it off and say, you guys got me, I got it, now I'm not going to let it happen again, then it's a lot easier to start moving forward and learning this stuff and protecting ourselves and our families.
Can you hear me, Ian?
Yep.
Yeah, it just seems like our generation now, people don't process information at all. They just, with the Facebook generation, they just regurgitate it without even thinking about it. And I know from my own perspective, when I read something online, I've sort of trained my mind that if something seems askew, I'll go look up the fallacies, and you can usually pick one out that will apply and explain to you what the problem is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's a good segue here. So, there's two forms of logical fallacies. There's formal and informal, and informal are typically the more spoken ones. And I really recommend people spend, every day for a month or two just studying the logical fallacies. I've got videos up on my website and, things people can download and study them. And I would practice memorizing the logical fallacies every day for a month or two until you have them memorized, until your brain really knows them. Because when, logical fallacies, the word fallacy comes from the Latin fallare, to deceive or to lie. And so they're ways that people use to just, they're emotional tricks and et cetera that people use to trick us. And they're written words, in the formal version that are used to trick us. So if you want to be able to catch when you're being lied to, you have to really know them. Without without a knowledge of the logical fallacies, you have virtually no protection against someone who wants to manipulate you, and that goes as far as mind control as well. Now, and a lot of people say, well, mind control, whoa, well, that's, conspiracy theory. But when you understand logic and the logical fallacies, you can understand how easy, mind control really is. And so when people don't understand the logical fallacies, for instance, if I don't want you to study something, I can say, you shouldn't listen to Jan Irvin because, and you make up anything about me. He's a commie, he's a CIA agent, and, that's the latest rumor that I hear floating around that they're saying about me to get people to not look at any of my work. But, these are all ad hominem attacks, which is attacking the man. You wear pink shirts on Fridays, so everything you say can't be correct, or you're a Republican or a Christian or a Muslim, so therefore nothing you say can be correct. We shouldn't listen to you. So, these are fallacies that people use to dismiss you. And then there's appeal to emotion, where they'll, if you do this thing for me, you'll be a superstar, and we'll, give you all of this and that, and they'll appeal to your emotions, and they'll appeal to your sense of popularity, and your sense of getting women or men, and all of these different things. So this is really how they keep this stuff going.
Jan, you might have a better idea than I do, but I went to schools where they used classical education, and so I'm kind of a little bit out of it in terms of, do they really not teach these basics of who, what, when, where, and then moving on? I mean, is it really that bad? I mean, I get that feeling because when I visit the States, I see so many people who seem dysfunctional. They can't give correct change and so on and so forth. But really, they don't teach basic questions like that?
Right. Well, they do, but they don't teach them properly and how to use them, and
I guess
when
that's kind of the question. I know they're spinning it. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. But, and there's even two forms of the trivium itself. There's the classical version of the trivium, which is essentially used for control. And then there's the inverse of that, or similar to the inverse, which is the trivium method, which exposes the classical trivium. So when you get into these things, there's, you need to actually study both of it so that you understand how it works, because the only way we can protect ourselves is to know it, and, to level the playing field so that everybody has it. The only way that they can use it against you is if you're ignorant of it, or if you're, afraid to study it, or go look at it, that sort of thing. But the schools here and the classical education, I get emails from all over the world from people about it, but they've pretty much stripped this stuff out everywhere, and now they want to bring in this common core education around the globe, which will strip it out further everywhere. But again, they're, like in the 1800s in the U.S., there was a strong propensity towards trivium style education in the single room schoolhouses, and this is really what launched the American Industrial Revolution. And you had 12-year-olds that could run companies and things like this, because they had the critical thinking skills to do so. The 8th grade, the 1890s 8th grade graduation test was tougher than a bachelor's degree graduation test today. So, we do know that there has been a heavy intentional dumbing down of the education that Charlotte Iserbyt has exposed, John Taylor Gatto. People can check out Richard Grove's interview with John Taylor Gatto, the Ultimate History lesson from the Gnostic Media website. I might have to, that link might not be up right now. We're putting up a new theme on the website, et cetera. But so there is a history there that people can check out and study. I recommend people study everything by John Taylor Gatto, because he really exposes that whole dumbing down. But this even goes clear back to the Prussian education system, and it's certainly spread through Canada and other countries as well.
Well, I think we see a dumbing down occurring across the Western world anyway, or the Western influenced world. But I can give you an example that would still kind of shock Americans. But in Japan, for example, the newspapers, the entrance exam, well, the school year is in April, not in September, and things like that. But the newspapers publish entrance exams, a couple pages of questions each year from past exams. And they don't have a national exam; they have a different one for different universities. And the questions to enter university frequently I would consider to be practically PhD level in the U.S. Um, Americans would be in shock to realize how difficult these questions are. I don't really think that specialists could answer them. Like, of the following 8 reasons, which 5 do historians think led to the decline and fall of the Byzantine Empire? Things like that. The rise of the spice trade through Yemen and stuff like that. And the average 17-year-old in the United States wouldn't know where Yemen is.
Right, but
Right.
I mean, it's not something that if you spent, 5 or 7 minutes researching, you couldn't handle.
Exactly. And it's totally overkill on the memorization approach. And that's a serious weakness with this. But nonetheless, it does show what people are capable of, and it also shows how dumbed down people have become in the West. But
Sure.
I guess we ought to go on to, though, the issue of the quadrivium, because that comes along with it. Do you want to give us a little bit on that?
Yeah, we can touch on that. The quadrivium is essentially the higher level of the 7 liberal arts, and I should say that the trivium and quadrivium together compose the 7 liberal or the 7 free arts, which free the individual. And so the first 3 were the trivium, which are grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or who, what, where, when, why, and how. So the next part is when we get out into nature and, now we've found these nouns out there, these trees and the world and everything, then we're going to want to count them and measure them and find out, what they're about. How many sheep do we have and whatever. So the first thing that we come across in the quadrivium is arithmetic. And then the next one is geometry. And then the next is music, and then the next is astronomy. Now, just like the trivium, if you take any of these out of order, you basically get a dysfunctional person. Now, in the West and most schools today, they teach algebra before geometry. Now, this, of course, is done intentionally because if you teach algebra before geometry, then you get a bunch of kids who get completely lost and confused, and then they don't know possibly what they would ever apply that nonsense to out in the real world or in their daily lives. So when you put these things back in order, when you get that algebra comes out of geometry, and if you teach geometry first, then the child gets that, oh, I can study a pine cone, or I can measure this ball, or I can look at the Fibonacci sequence in a sunflower, or any of these other things, and I can see where I can apply this stuff directly to understanding the world around you, right? And so this is the key in mixing this stuff up as well. So the quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and it's always in this order. Arithmetic is really, it's number by itself. And let me just pull up a little more on it here. But we have, we have arithmetic, which pertains to matter and quantity, the advanced 4. And so it's arithmetic is number in itself, which is a pure abstraction, and it's outside of space and time. And so then the next phase is geometry, which is number in space. Okay, so now you're measuring from point A to point B, et cetera. And then music or harmonic theory is number in time. And then when you get into astronomy, astronomy is number in space and time. So you can see that these things fill out and fill each other out and build from one another. And then from there you get into calculus and trigonometry, etc., and they all build one after the other, but they need to be done in the order that they were historically discovered because they're based on the prior, and without understanding, then then you end up with the confusion, just like if you put logic before grammar and you end up with that confusion or that constant appeal to authority. When you put algebra before geometry, you end up with the same effect in the child. They get confused. And in my case, I went from sixth grade, math being my favorite subject, to seventh grade actually hating it more than any other subject and pretty much destroying it for me for most of the rest of my life.
What happened?
Well, they put algebra before geometry.
Algebra before geometry. Is that really the way it's done now?
Yeah, that's pretty much how it's done everywhere.
When did that happen?
Oh, they've probably been doing. I mean, pretty much they just reverse all of the trivium stuff and mix it all up, and it's probably, I don't know. I went to school junior high in the '80s, and I know people that have told me that it was done to them way before that too. So I would imagine they've been doing it at least 50 to 80 years or more.
Because I thought I definitely recall studying geometry before algebra.
Well, you got lucky then. You're one of the few.
Okay. Well, but again, it makes sense that they would intentionally confuse us. That's the entire goal, is to do things in such a way that it doesn't have any context.
Exactly.
That is the problem. But well, so recently there's been a great increase in interest in this topic. It's not just I guess what you would say the trivium and quadrivium. It's the whole John Taylor Gatto and Charlotte Iserbyt and the whole idea of the deliberate dumbing down, and we need to reverse this. And as you mentioned, Gatto's books are really quite worth reading. Have you also seen, I mean, are you, for example, getting interview requests with, I don't know, TV shows or anything? I mean, are we seeing kind of a movement spreading with this trivium and quadrivium?
Well, never a TV show, but there's been a few dozens of, radio interviews and things. So,
well, you have to start, cheer up, yeah. And I mean, it's a, I mean.
Well, I just don't see the mainstream media. I don't see the mainstream media wanting to put on any segments that would expose all of the fallacies used in their commercials in between each segment. I mean, if somebody got on and taught the trivium on national television, you would instantly create a million people who could see through all of that stuff. It takes about 40 minutes to teach somebody the logical fallacies to the level where they can go turn on a television and start seeing it all in the commercials and everything.
Well, I don't think we should be so pessimistic, though. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that a TV show like, let's say, Jeopardy in the 60s was incredibly difficult. And then now it's simply, what TV star had what surgery or something like that, right? It's
Well, I don't watch TV, so you couldn't tell.
Well, neither do I, but I'm just pointing out that as a kid, I can say that
I saw it at a restaurant. Yeah.
In 1965, one of the categories would be Shakespeare. One of the categories would be, African, geography, right?
Sure.
Which river goes where, that kind of thing, right? Now, you can say that's not exciting.
My television trivia, but I'll take your word for it.
Well, I'm just saying I'm not up on it at all, but I'm just pointing out.
Well, I'm just saying you're asking me right, and I don't want to acknowledge something that I have no grammar on. Is all I'm saying. So I'll just agree with you for your sake. Right, and for the sake of making the point, right?
Yeah. Well, so I think you can see that.
That's really. Let me just interrupt you there. That's really the point of the trivium. Is when somebody asks you something about that, you look in your repertoire of any information, you go, do I have anything to verify that? I don't know anything about Jeopardy trivia, so I can't really acknowledge that. And then you can just state it in a caveated way like I did. I mean, that's really the point of the trivium. Or I can go, you know what? Let me just look up a little bit of early Jeopardy, and I'll do some grammar here, and I'll watch a handful of early shows, and I'll see if what this guy is saying, and I'll compare him, to more recent ones. So
Well, that's totally fair. That's the idea. Is
exactly.
you don't have to acknowledge um, things. You can just say, for the sake of the argument, let's continue. Um, but I think it stands to reason in general that we've seen an across the board dumbing down in Western society, and that would include TV shows or whatever the curriculum in local schools. But anyway, I think this is not something you're going to go on TV with, but I think we can imagine that there are a lot of people who are concerned, and there are now occasional conferences. I saw Charlotte Iserbit at a conference that essentially was dedicated to this whole topic of how to resist the dumbing down. And
Well, that's interesting. I had a couple years ago, I tried to get Charlotte on my show, but she was actually very against logic, which is interesting. And she's put out a lot of good work, and I don't mean to knock her too much, but she has the very Spockian view of what logic is, and doesn't understand the trivium and how it works. So, but that's just, anyway, that's a side issue. But yeah, I mean, definitely study Charlotte Iserbit's book, The Dumbing Down of America, or whatever her book is, and Gatto's books, Underground History of American Education and Weapons of Mass Instruction, and all of those good books.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, broadly speaking, those of us who feel that the system's gone wrong and we need to kind of realize, why did we have such tremendous success, 200 years ago?
Sure. Well,
and
it's when you step back and look at it, the answer is obvious. But and that was my point for mentioning her attack on logic, is just that we're going to need the trivium, we're going to need critical thinking, we're going to need epistemology and ethics and all of this stuff to break us away. We're going to need to understand natural law for all of those who think natural law doesn't exist, and when you get in and study the trivium and quadrivium, you realize, oh, yes, it certainly does exist. But, people need to understand all of these things, because all of this irrational behavior that we can control others and use fallacies to manipulate them and create new age religions to bring about a new dark age and all of this sort of stuff that they've been selling down the pipe, the archaic revival, as you wanted to call this episode. So, all of that stuff is really these people misusing the trivium, and rather than empowering people and lifting them up and encouraging them to go out and seek the information for themselves and trust their own five senses to tell them the truth. I mean, most people today believe that they cannot trust their own five senses to give them information and to find answers. And that is a serious problem. So we need people to, be able to trust themselves again, to be able to go out and look things up, to not just say, it's going to be too hard to look something up. It's easier for me to just go on living in ignorance. I mean, seriously, type it in Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever search engine you use, and type it in there and spend a few minutes to look it up and find out if your beliefs are true. And if you learn those logical fallacies and if you memorize them, you'll find that you can actually research things in half the time or less than you could before, because you can cut right through all of the deceptions and all of the lies that people use to trick themselves and others. And the coolest thing is, around 2 months after you've memorized logical fallacies, you can start removing them from your own thoughts and the things in your own mind that you've held on to. And you can look at things and say, where did I get this from? Is this based on truth or a lie? And if it's based on a lie, well, let me go check it and just find out if it's real. And then you're not holding on to this idea in your head for your entire lifetime that's based on BS,
Yeah, I've printed out logical fallacies and just left them, or posted them on the wall next to my computer, that kind of thing.
Sure.
My office, just to remind me that they're, because you run into them every day. They're all over the place, and you can fall victim to them easily.
Sure. And we started. Let me just say, we just started recently selling logical fallacy bookmarks on the website because, you're always in the book and what's that fallacy? And then, it's right there and then it helps you memorize it. So
Someone needs to make an iPhone app.
yeah, there you go.
And need to tell them, think about the downside of iPhones. But anyway, that's another thing.
Yeah, no kidding. And by the way, people can go to the study materials page where it says documents, and they can download a little thing with the primary logical fallacies on it, so that you can just stick it in your pocket, and then you have it right there all the time, or your purse, ladies.
So yeah, and going forward, what do you want to do any speculating about how the powers that be might, I don't know what you want to call it, promote the SOMA, or what they might be up to as compared to the last, we've been discussing some of what happened 30, 40, 50 years ago. What do you see around the bend, so to speak?
Well, I mean, more drugs in the water, more chemtrails, more wheat and things like that in the diet, more low-fat diet being sold, more Lipitor being sold, more of the cholesterol is bad lie being sold, all of those things together being sold, fluoride in the water, and put them all together and you have a real pretty picture of the direction that they want to go. And if you just look at any one of them individually, you don't really see it, but just step back and look at all of them, and you can see that the direction that they want to go is Huxley's Brave New World, and you can see that the drugs in the water supply and people wanting a pill for every emotion, and I can't be depressed, and I can't feel sad, I need a pill, and even some of these pills, there was one of these pills like Prozac is named Soma. So it couldn't be any more ironic, and this is Huxley's dream. He did want everybody dumbed down and drugged, and his whole idea of transcendence, when you get in and read his books, his idea of transcendence was to get the people so high on drugs that they transcended their slave state and didn't care about it.
With the economy collapsing now, Jan, it seems like the powers that be are sort of liberalizing the marijuana laws. I would assume that's to sedate people so they don't feel the pain as much.
Well, and that's an interesting thing, and that battle has been going on for so long. Who knows? I mean, they banned it at the height of the Great Depression, et cetera, and with cannabis, I think it's actually, in most of these drugs, they're actually more popular when they're illegal. Cannabis, and the whole hemp issue is really interesting because, obviously hemp can be used for so many things that can make us independent. And, and they don't like independence. They don't like ranchers. They don't like, gardens. They don't like you collecting rainwater on your own land, all of this sort of stuff. And hemp is one of these things, but, I see that too. But, ironically, well, I've never done any of my research on any of this stuff exposing what I have not under the influence of cannabis. So it hasn't prevented me from thinking or being active about it.
Yeah, I guess my point is that when the powers that be push it, they tend to push the dark side of it. I'm not saying cannabis is bad necessarily, but the way it's being promoted, I think.
Well, and that's possible. I mean, we wanted blanket legalization, and I was the Inland Empire coordinator for the California Hemp Initiative back in the early 90s, and I also worked on California's Prop 215, and we were key people involved in all of that. But we never liked Prop 215. We wanted total legalization, including industrial hemp, and to get everybody out of jail. And of course, they didn't want that. They didn't want, they like to be able to use cannabis to do these no-knock entries and, searches and things like that. So, that they can target, as Jolyon West quotes, in my Manufacturing the Deadhead article, so that way they can target certain segments of society. And so there's always this influx of these things. But interestingly, they didn't want it legalized in California. They went to Colorado and Washington, you know. So, yeah, you know, I see it, and, you know, I don't quite know what to think of that whole thing yet. We'll have to see.
Well, I think we can see that there are mixed, you know, industry or financial interests in different regions and various other things. I mean, the prison complex is a huge industry in the U.S., but some people like Catherine Austin Fitts feel that we may be kind of moving away from that. Maybe they want to empty the prisons, drive the wages down, create some more crime, you know, that kind of thing.
Well, the problem with
you know,
legalizing it, though, is that there's less crime when you legalize things like that than more, because it's the outline of such things that creates the crime in the first place, you know.
Sure, but they can choose who to let out of prison. They can all be done in a controlled way. They might choose to let out more violent criminals, and you know, we just can't know. That's all speculation. But we'll just have to see how it.
Well, yeah.
How it
I mean,
plays
they've always
out.
given the violent criminals have always had shorter sentences than marijuana offenders, you know, or typically anyway.
Which is kind of crazy. So it's truly a crazy world. But anyway, I think we can wrap it up now. We're kind of running along, and I think we've covered the basics. And so I think we need to let people know that your website is, one of them is gnosticmedia.com. And anything else, your books, or you have triviumeducation.com as well?
Sure.
And
Well,
anything
you know,
else we should mention?
Well, you know, the show is run entirely on donations and our website sales. So anybody who orders a book or donates or anything are directly helping to support us continue to, you know, to put out the Trivium work and to continue to put out work on MK Ultra and this Archaic revival, Neo-Feudalism stuff that we've been working so hard to expose. And so everyone's help is appreciated on that. And you know, like I said before, key thing is that if you don't study the Trivium, folks, it can be and likely is and will be used against you. So take up a good study of it, and you'll, you know, right around the 2-year mark, it really becomes automatic. And so, you know, from that point, instead of having that funny feeling or, you know, that implicit feeling from your intuition that somebody just lied to you, you get that intuition coming in, and it takes it over to your left side of the brain, and it tells you exactly which kind of lie was just used against you. So then you have explicit knowledge, and then your intuition and your logic are working in balance.
I'll take your word on that. No, just kidding. Because I've used it myself. But anyway, the point is you need to trust but verify, something like that. So let's wrap it up. So thanks, Jan.
Trust yourself. Yeah.
And Oolong, thanks for joining us. And that's it. It's a wrap for this week, folks. Thanks much
Jan.
for coming.
Thank you all.